Hey, everybody. This is Matthew Namee and Deacon Seraphim Rohlin from the Orthodox Studies Institute. And we've been talking behind the scenes a little bit lately about, we like to talk about data and orthodoxy, especially orthodoxy in America. And there was a few weeks ago a pretty interesting interview that was done by Ross Douthat of the New York Times, interviewing Ryan Burge, who's a very noted, popular writer and professor on sociology of religion, publishes a lot of really interesting analytics on religion in America and so forth. They did a pretty lengthy interview, and orthodoxy came up in that interview. And so we've been behind the scenes kind of talking about Burge's observations. How does that fit with the data that we have? And so we thought we'd make a little podcast about it.
Yeah, and it's it's one of those the meme. It's just like you are by far the smallest church I've ever heard of. But you have heard of me. That is kind of how the interview felt for me. So he's basically says he's not very interested in orthodoxy because it is small and it's going to continue to remain a sort of a small outlier on the American, on the American religious landscape. So there's not a huge point talking about it. And I actually think like this is a kind of a fair point. So what I want to do today is I want to actually go through some of the things that he just notes about other Christian traditions and non-Christian religious traditions. And then what I'd like to do, and maybe what's the takeaway for Orthodox evangelism. And then what I want to get into is what he said about orthodoxy and kind of what do we think about his numbers, his estimates, and if he's right, what does that mean for us? But the thing that I'll start with is that, and I've been on the road. Just for context, I've been on the road a lot lately. It's just why I'm so tired right now. I've been on the road a lot lately, and I've been talking to people about the convert surge. I've been talking to people about evangelism. Obviously, this is not just an academic thing for either one of us. We are part of a global conspiracy to convert every single human being on the planet to the Orthodox Christian faith. It's a little thing called the Great Commission. And obviously, maybe we don't go about this the same way that other Christian traditions would go about it. But, ultimately, that's the goal, is I want to see everyone be a Christian. I want to see everyone be an Orthodox Christian. So when I'm talking about these things, it's always in the context of figuring out what is necessary for evangelism. That's one thing. And for the overall continued flourishing of the church as it grows, that make sure that we don't just sort of, peak and then everything washes away. So making sure that house is built on the rock, so to speak.
The other thing I would add is, and as some people will know, I do a lot of church history. So do you.
Yeah.
And we both have the view that the kind of premise that the Orthodox Church, being the body of Christ, is the main character of history. And,
that's right.
Which also means we're the main character. The Orthodox Church is the main character of the present day, regardless of our size. Just as Israel was the main character in ancient Israel, right? The main character of ancient history was ancient Israel, even though it was,
historically, historically it would have been, a very, 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 very small kingdom compared to, the great empires, the Egyptians, the Hittites, and so on. But so all of this being said, that's kind of where we're coming from in this. So one of the things that happened as I was traveling around talking to people is you would I think for the most part, clergy, faithful, everybody I talked to, at this point, they've hit a point where they can't ignore the fact that there is, in fact, a convert surge happening. They just can't ignore it. The churches are full. I was in North Carolina, for instance, where the churches are just overflowing. I'm just completely overflowing. But there's other parishes in South Carolina and other parts of the South that are seeing, double, triple the numbers that they saw 10, 15 years ago, right? So it's impossible at this point to argue, I think, that it's not happening, at least in some places. So people kind of shifted away from that. And now the thing they're sort of saying is, okay, yeah, but nobody's saying we're going to take over the place. And two things about that. One is, well, sure, but why not try? But the second thing I would want to say to that is, that's never been your argument or my argument. That's never been what OSI has been trying to convince people of. What we've been trying to convince people of is our churches are growing, and even a small percentage increase of the overall population, if even 1% of America, if even half of a percent of America were to walk in Sunday morning to our churches, would we be ready for that? And obviously the answer is no. And so trying to get us in a place where we are ready for that, that's kind of the thing that we're focused on. If you think about, if you have a young couple who has, they've just gotten married and they've just started having kids and they have 2 children. All right. Well, there's only, they went from 2 to 4 people in the family, but for them, that is a 100% increase. Now, to do another 100% increase, they're going to have several more children and so on. Right. So you get the idea, which means that when we talk about Orthodoxy growing, we think maybe 69% in the next 15 to 20 years. Well, nobody's saying that, then we'll be the dominant religion in America. And I think somehow people are hearing that, and that's never been what we've been saying. But what we have been saying is people are coming into the church, and they're coming, and a lot of them seem to be staying, and they seem to be having children. And if that continues the next 15, 20 years, what do we need to do to kind of rise to the challenge that's being placed before us? So that's kind of the focus. What I want to do today is talk through some of the things that Burge said about the other denominations and then about Orthodoxy specifically, and then kind of get into this question, which seems to be, at the end of the day, the question that we have to keep coming back to, which is how many Orthodox Christians actually are there in America? Obviously, it's a number that is constantly changing, but one of the great difficulties is how you could, even measure such a thing right now. So we'll talk about that. All right. So I thought what I would do is just kind of read through some of the things, and then we'll get to a specific quote about Orthodoxy. So Burge starts by talking about mainline Protestants. By the mainlines, we really mean like Presbyterians, Lutherans, Episcopalians, the UCC, maybe Methodists, and some kinds of Baptists, depending on just how you slice that particular pie. But Burge's point about these churches, which are of course in decline, one you could even say is sort of a free fall based on the latest data, is that these are churches which are squishy on core theological doctrines, things like whether or not the resurrection even actually happened, whether or not miracles are real, whether or not how you should read and interpret the scriptures, and of course the church's moral law. Right, teachings on sex and gender and all those other things that are so much of the forefront now of political and religious discourse in our country. And what he says is that the mainlines, in his view, the mainlines decline stems from the fact that they've just become indistinguishable from secular culture. So there's this idea that the mainline churches would have been this diverse meeting place for all these various perspectives. This belief that a left of center, pluralistic, post-liberal society is always the inevitable outcome of dialogue, right? So nobody ever says, "Hey, let's dialogue with these things on the right and see if maybe there's something there that we should kind of move towards a more conservative position." It's always it pretty much just goes the other way. And so that's one thing that happened, which tended to make these mainline churches kind of echo chambers, which failed to offer a really distinctive identity compared to the culture around them. So this is what Burge is saying, and obviously there's an implication for us in terms of evangelism, which is that doctrinal clarity, which, by the way, does not mean picking the position or opinion of one of the ruling political parties. In my experience, it almost never means that. But doctrinal clarity about what the tradition really teaches is a source for us of institutional strength. And this is a big reason a lot of people are drawn to the Orthodox Church. Now, in the evangelical world, which is still growing, at least in certain age groups, certain demographics. A lot of this, Burge saw a lot of this growth as being kind of politically, tribally motivated, right? It offers a clear sense of identity, kind of an us versus them, or again, there's a lot of involvement with politics and cultural issues and things like that. Obviously, the form of evangelicalism, which is growing the most, really the only one that's growing rapidly, is the more charismatic streams of evangelicalism, which have this focus on something that's emotional, something that's experiential, and also it is a kind of Christianity which comes, and I think this is very important, with supernatural expectations. So, as a catechist, when somebody comes in from a Pentecostal background, that person is very often easier to catechize because they at least already believe in the supernatural. They already believe that God is still active in the world, that the Holy Spirit is in all things, is filling all things, is moving in the world, right? So their question usually is not, okay, but, how do you know that, these aren't all just, mass hallucinations or something that you guys are having? But their question is rather usually about their prior religious experience and they say, well, listen, I've had some things that felt like a mystical experience or felt like an outpouring of the Holy Spirit. What does the Orthodox Church have to say about those things? Burge says that Pentecostalism and charismatic theology is the most probable future of American Christianity. And I think in some, a religion of the future, if you will. But I think that probably he's right about that, at least in the next 100 years. How is this relevant to Orthodox evangelism? Well, Orthodoxy has this emphasis on both kind of you can have both dogmatic rigor, but then also you can be open to something that's experiential, open to these mystical experiences of God, right? And so this gives us, we kind of have all the tools. One of the things that I find, again, with catechumens who are coming from Pentecostal charismatic backgrounds, is that they find within Orthodoxy, they find a sobriety and a steadiness without without the disenchantment that comes from like a more fundamentalist background like the one that I grew up in.
And just for some context,
yeah.
So I just looked this up to make sure I had things straight. The largest Pentecostal denomination in America is the Assemblies of God, and based on what I'm seeing, it looks like they have about 3 million adherents in the United States. Yep. And membership is somewhere in the 2 million range. Of course, there are plenty of other different flavors of Pentecostalism, but it looks like they're bigger than Assemblies of God. There are more of them than there are Orthodox Christians in America, but not dramatically. So if he's saying that the future, go ahead.
Yeah, well, okay, but the thing is though, is that when you're talking about this as a movement, and here I'll put on my ex-evangelical hat for a moment to talk about what it's like out there, because your family's been Orthodox since the Apostle Paul, right? And so you don't have like literally since the Apostle Paul.
We are not contexted on this stuff.
Yes, yeah, you're not contexted on this stuff. So when we talk about charismatic or Pentecostal evangelicalism, we're not even so much talking about denominations. Yes, obviously AOG is the biggest one out there under the name of, right? But most people where I live, for instance, attend large megachurches, which are very often not actually affiliated with any denomination, or if they are, the affiliation is extremely loose because the denomination itself is institutionally decentralized and weak by design. And so all of the money, the power, the energy is within that megachurch, and that megachurch might have multiple campuses. And we down here, we call them, and it's not a pejorative, this is just what everybody calls them, Bapticostals, because the theology and the practice is like a little bit of Baptist, it's a little bit of Pentecostal, but it's really all about the, who's the pastor in charge, and what is he or she like, what are they really motivated by. And so you'll go through you'll have like a more kind of a large mega church with kind of maybe a more reformed background, and then they get a new pastor and he is really into the more charismatic stuff, and so things kind of start to change. So it's really tricky to nail this down. You can't just track like AOG, because a lot of the Pentecostalism or charismatic movement stuff is now kind of becoming as these various distinct evangelical groups kind of all meld into these big mega churches. There's just all these different ingredients that go into the soup, you could say. So
you may have, from what I'm seeing, 60 plus million Americans that
Yeah.
are in the kind of broader umbrella of Pentecostalism,
That's right. That's
even if
right.
they're
Yeah.
not in like a
So
Pentecostal
yeah,
denomination per se.
that's right. And obviously, of course, we're mostly talking about America today, but Pentecostal versions of Christianity are still growing. You know, the fastest growing kind of Christianity around the world, especially in the global South. So again, what's the implication for Orthodox evangelism? Well, I think the biggest implication is we can say affirmatively, yes, the Holy Spirit has never left. He's totally active. He's totally present. Miracles really do happen, but also, they come within the context of an ascetic tradition, right? And so we do have miracle working saints. We continue to produce them. It is one of the marks of our identity as the church, right? But those miracles usually come in the context of somebody who has who has struggled against their passions, against the world, against the flesh, against the devil, as opposed to just being something that is sort of cheaply obtained and then kind of leaves you afterwards kind of feeling a little empty. So, all right. Burge then talks about Catholicism, and he says he brings up the example, of course, of Vice President J.D. Vance, that Catholicism is attracting a lot of converts right now, especially in places like California, but that most of these people are educated elites, and that there are kind of like two different kinds of Catholics: the people who disagree with the church hierarchy, like the traditionalists. So they sort of disagree with the direction of the church hierarchy, but they stick around for the sacramental theology in the institution. And then the flip of that, which is people who disagree with church teaching, on the left, but then again, they're sticking around for the community, for the institution. According to Burge, the Roman Catholics are losing a lot of Hispanic working class base, specifically to Pentecostalism. I've definitely seen a lot of that around here. And that traditionalist Latin Mass Catholicism is growing amongst younger conservatives, but it's still a pretty niche thing, which again seems right to me. Again, this is, I think the implications here for Orthodox evangelism are probably the easiest to figure out. It's obviously my belief, and I don't mean to throw any shade at anybody here, but all the things that you would want to find in Roman Catholicism, you will actually find in their fullness within the Orthodox Church. Non-Christian religions. This is kind of where he gets into when he gets into basically, as far as Burge is concerned, things like Islam, Buddhism, Hinduism are just rounding errors in America right now compared to Christianity. And while that's true, it is definitely the case that there are places like where I live, where there's been a massive amount of immigration, and which has resulted in, they're now building Hindu temples near my house with massive, massive statues of Hindu gods, out in front of you, sort of driving through suburban DFW, and suddenly there's a massive, statue of Ganesh or some other Hindu deity. So this is something that we really need to think about: is how do we, paganism is coming back. It's coming to our shores. The good news is that Orthodox Christianity has a great track record evangelizing pagans, which is why we're all here. So this is something we need to really think about: is how can we reach these people? We have, I would say, a non-trivial number of people from these East Asian backgrounds coming into the Orthodox Church right now here in the Dallas area. So this is something that we need to really think about it, and also just one of the implications of having pagans, whether was like Far Eastern paganism or just neo-paganism, right? Just, people trying to reconstruct the worship of Odin or something like that, is that very often, these are not ex-evangelicals. These are not people their catechetical needs are totally different. You cannot just assume a high level of biblical literacy. You cannot just assume, hey, I can just hand you a copy of Timothy Ware's, The Orthodox Church, The Orthodox Way, Metropolitan Philistos, rather, and then just assume that they're going to be instant, like, read this book and then we'll baptize you or whatever. Like, we need to really think about people coming from these backgrounds. What are the things that they need to learn? What are the things they need to unlearn? How did the early church approach this kind of catechesis? And then he mentions a few small growing denominations. In the Anglican Church in North America, which has had small but sustained growth for the last 15 years. The Presbyterian Church in America, the PCA, Assemblies of God being the only large Protestant denomination that is growing right now, according to Burge. So these small what the ACNA and PCA have in common is that they are smaller, more doctrinally traditional, at least from a Protestant perspective, denominations. So then, of course, we get to his comment about Orthodoxy, and this is what he says. And I think we're going to
hold on. Just want to give some context real quick.
Yes.
Just so like we have our bearings, because at least as a cradle Orthodox friend, I gotta be like, how big are these people? I can't really tell. So the PCA, the Presbyterian Church in America, based on the current numbers that are their estimates that are out there, has a membership of around 400,000 people. So that would put them comparable to, well, so if you go by Alexei Krindach's 2020 numbers for the Greek Archdiocese, it's pretty comparable, right? It's put them in that ballpark. Not necessarily endorsing that methodology, but to just give some context, right? And then the ACNA, the Anglican Church in North America, which is that kind of slightly more, I was going to say conservative or whatever, but relative to the Episcopal Church, they're conservative. Not relative to us. But relative to the Episcopalians, they're conservative. So their membership is estimated at 130,000 people, which would make them, again, just if we go by Krindach's numbers, with big caveats there, kind of in the neighborhood of the OCA or the Antiochian Archdiocese in the United States. So the U.S. portion of those jurisdictions. So so we're not talking about those two denominations are not massive, right? They look kind of like the size of an Orthodox jurisdiction is what they look like.
Right.
Hinduism in America is bigger. Hinduism, it's hard to get a really good estimate because of various, there's just issues as we've seen with Orthodoxy there. We're going to see there's issues with how you get the actual samples, but maybe 3 million Hindus in America right now, which is kind of a lot, actually. It's like 1% of the population.
That's right.
But anyway, I just wanted to give a little context before we show the Burge bit.
Yeah. So we've got this clip from Burge, which I think we'll just roll now.
Now, can you tell in the data whether what this means for specific churches, right? So, for instance, one of my colleagues just wrote a big story that I think you commented on about Eastern Orthodoxy in America, right? Which is a very small part of American religion, but there are a lot of stories, and I've heard them myself, about male converts to Eastern Orthodoxy being a big thing, right? So that would be a small example where you might say, okay, you have men sticking with Christianity or returning to it in particular places, but it's going to create a dynamic where some churches are much more male and some churches are much more female.
The Orthodox story is interesting, don't get me wrong, but we have to put them in context. There's less than 1 million people going to Orthodox Church in America. Of a country of 330 million people, Southern Baptists, there's 7 million Southern Baptists who go to church every Sunday. So let's put things in their proper orbit. My job is to sort of not look at the outliers, it's to look at the middle of the distribution.
Okay. So, Matthew, I'm sure you have thoughts about that.
Yeah. So, I mean, Burge is right in one sense, right? I mean, he's absolutely right that if he's a sociologist of religion, he's looking at big picture kind of stuff, big picture trends. And in that context, Orthodoxy is kind of a rounding error. When you put it in the context of, there's 7 million Baptists, we're really small. So we're kind of a little footnote maybe, which is kind of what we were for this article, right? Or this interview that he did with Ross Douthat. It was it's a sidebar, it's a curiosity. Right. It's not really a serious, of course, that's true based on his premises, right? I mean, it's true. But of course, also from our perspective, the Orthodox Church is the main character of history. So that's kind of important. Also, we are Orthodox. That's the thing we focus on.
Right.
That's also really, so our job while it's good to be contexted on what's going on in broader kind of American religion, like that's Burge's bread and butter. That's great for him. We're focusing on Orthodoxy specifically because that's what we're here to do.
I certainly was not drawn to the Orthodox Church because it was mainstream, or I was already in the evangelical mainstream. Like I've already done that. So in the sense that we're an outlier, I absolutely agree with that. And I just want to be very clear that I don't think Burge is wrong when he says we're an outlier, but he says he's not interested in outliers, which is fine. But obviously we are. So some of the things he says here, this less than 1 million figure is very unclear to me. And I don't want to push too hard on this because Burge sort of said this offhand. It's not like he was doing a detailed study on this. So I'm not really picking at him. I don't want to seem like I'm just picking at him on this. But obviously, like, what does that mean? Is it active attendees? Is it catechumens, full communicants?
Presumably, that's just I would assume that's based on the Alexei Krindach numbers in the U.S. religion census in 2020. So just to give like a little bit on it. Just
can you give us a little bit of a background on the Krindach survey, because it's one of the ones that a lot of people have to rely on?
It's called a census. It's not exactly a census. The U.S. religion census is a broader thing. Alexei Krindach is a sociologist of religion who focuses on Orthodoxy, and he conducts the Orthodox portion of that study. It's done every 10 years. So he did it in 2010. He did the new one in 2020. And what it involves is they send out essentially a 2-question survey to every Orthodox, in his case, every Orthodox parish in America. And he's asking, and I don't have the questions in front of me, but basically he's asking 2 things. One is, how many people, broadly speaking, are associated with your parish in some way? And then on a typical Sunday, how many people do you have in church? So you're asking, almost every respondent is going to be the parish priest. And there's no clear instructions or methodological approaches being taken on, like, you kind of are left to what does the priest think, right? So in some parishes, you have people doing head counts every week. So you can get a really good number of weekly attendance. In other parishes, you're not getting that at all. It's just the priest is kind of ballparking. He's like, I think that's 200 people, right? And so, there's that issue. And then how many people are associated with your parish? I mean, how many people are on the rolls? How many people are in the directory? How many families did I do house blessings for last year? Right. I mean, there's all different kinds of ways to approach this. And so it can be fuzzy, I guess, is my point. And so I don't take those numbers as kind of gospel. I think that they're useful to an extent, but we definitely know that one thing they're not asking one of the things that Burge often is looking at in some of his analyses, which is how many people self-identify as Orthodox. Right. When they say, what's your religious affiliation? How many tick the box for Orthodox? That's a separate question. This is a question to pastors, asking them about their rough estimates for how many people are connected to their community. It's 2 different things. There's an overlap.
And to put it in a parallel, when you say something like, there's 7 million Southern Baptists. Well, do all 7 million of those Southern Baptists go to church every Sunday? Well, no.
That's what Burge was suggesting, actually. He said there's about 7 million Southern Baptists who go to church every Sunday.
7 million Southern Baptists go to church every Sunday. Yeah, okay. Totally
now, what is that based on? I don't know. I mean, it may be based on the religion census stuff. It may also be based on people self-reporting through surveys. So those are 2 different, totally different kinds of
So, I mean, we can talk about the difficulties of self-reporting church attendance, which is something people almost always lie about, usually by like at least one category shift. If somebody goes to church once a month, they'll say they go every Sunday on a survey. Just like this is something that people are kind of famously dishonest about. But so that's the question. So all right, 7 million people, 7 million Southern Baptists go to church every Sunday. But then how many other people would say they're Southern Baptists who don't go to church every Sunday? And that's the difficulty that we run into. So when we're tracking self-identification versus some standard of faithfulness, like then the question being, when we're talking about Orthodox data, where do we set the bar for saying, yeah, somebody is a practicing Orthodox Christian? Is it liturgy every Sunday? Is it liturgy, the minimum, number of times required not to be in de facto excommunication with the church? Like, those are all kind of, it's an interesting question. And then obviously, you run into people who will tell you, yes, I'm Orthodox, but I haven't been to church in years and I don't believe in God anymore. I ran into somebody like this just the other day. And I was, okay, so in what sense at this point are you Orthodox? Well, because my mom is Orthodox, because, so there's also that person, and the way that person is going to fill out a self-identification survey is also, it leads to a difficult question. So all of this to say is...
And we've got people coming to our churches right now that are coming every Sunday that haven't become Orthodox. I don't know how they would answer a survey.
Right, yeah.
Like if they know enough, they're going to say, well, I'm not Orthodox, although that's probably the best answer. They might just say I'm Christian, right?
Right.
I don't know how they would answer that kind of a survey.
Right. That's a whole other thing, yeah, too. So one of the things that we've really got to figure out a way to do in our work is there's a lot of things. I somebody said, why don't these people just stick to Pew data? It's like, listen, this is what we're using. We're looking at Pew. We're looking at the Harvard CES. We're looking at FIRE. We're looking at all these different data sources that are available, right? And looking at that, we're looking at those different sources of data to try to get a picture, right? And so based on that picture, we have a number, and there's some evidence that might lead us to believe that the number is a little low, but the truth of it is that until we perform some much more detailed extended research of our own, which we're in the process of doing right now, it's going to be very, very hard to say with accuracy how many people, Orthodox Christians, show up to church on Sunday, how many people in America identify as Orthodox. If you've got people who identify as Orthodox but they're not coming to church on Sunday, again, ultimately the thing that's downstream of all of this for me is pastoral work. It's evangelism. How do you find out who those people are? How do you reach out to them? So
elsewhere in this same interview, Burge made a kind of brief comment about Orthodoxy where he actually made a statistical projection, kind of. I don't know how serious he was about this. I don't know that he actually put in, I don't know. I haven't talked to the guy about this, right? So I'm not sure. But here's the quote.
I think like the Orthodox Church is probably going to, do relatively well. But by relatively well, I mean like they might add 25% membership in the next 30 years. We're not talking.
So he did the interview at the end of 2025. So next 30 years would put us in, 2055, which feels like sci-fi at this point. But that's...
Yeah, this is right around the 56, 57 minute mark in the video. So it's right at the tail end. And by the way, one of the things he says is we're never going to see a mega denomination like the Southern Baptist Convention or the United Methodist Church ever again. That's in there as well. And it would be wrong to pass over that, because that is a hugely interesting thing for him to say. And I think there's some good insight in there. In general, I really liked the interview, in the sense that I thought that Burge had a lot of good insights, and this is one of them. This idea that just is going to be one big church, and pretty much all the Christians in the area, or all the Christians in a state, with where you have regions that are more strongly this than the other thing, right? So the Bible Belt was mainly Southern Baptist, and the Northeast was mainly mainline and things like that. That is really going away. And some of it is because some of these old institutions are crumbling, but it's also because of, immigration, because of, hypermobility. People are moving from state to state all the time. People are in general just becoming less religious. People are becoming more secular. So this, the age of like the mega denomination, I think, is one of the things that is coming to an end. And you'll still have really large, mega churches, but some of the biggest Southern Baptist megachurches split off over doctrinal issues from the SBC quite recently. And basically the argument was, we want to do this thing, in this case, ordain women as pastors, right? And the SBC says, no, you can't do that. And they said, well, we don't actually need the SBC for anything. It's not really doing anything for us to be a part of this. So why not just break off from the SBC and be our own thing? We're already, multi-campuses, tens of thousands of members, et cetera, et cetera. So I think you're going to have more mega churches, but the age of the mega denomination is probably over. And I thought, that's a side thing. It's not really what we're talking about today, but I thought it was an interesting insight on Burge's part. Yeah.
Yeah.
So what do you think about this?
25% growth, right? What do you think about
this
number?
Well, I was going to ask you what you thought about that number.
I mean, look, we've done our own projections, right? I mean, you've done projections using, honestly, similar data sets that Burge uses. So we've used the CES, the Cooperative Election Study. We've used that data set. Burge uses that extensively. We've used the Pew Religious Landscape Survey data. Again, that's something Burge uses. He also makes extensive use of the General Social Survey, which we can't do much with because the sample size is
the sample size for Orthodoxy is just very, very small in there. But I have been working on it, and there are a couple of interesting takeaways, maybe about convert retention, that if we find enough other data that kind of correlate, we might try to publish that. But all right, so this 25% number, again, I don't want to make Burge, I don't want to hold him to this number because again, I feel like it is something he said sort of off the cuff. He was just sort of estimating. But just for the fun of an intellectual exercise, what if we only see 25% growth only? See, that's, by the way, 25% growth is great. It's great. So as an intellectual exercise, if we just took this 25% growth over the next 30 years and we take our baseline of how many self-identifying Orthodox Christians that we have in America right now, which is about 1.64 million. There's some reason to think lately with some of the new stuff that's come out, some of the new data that's come out about Gen Z that we're still looking into, that maybe this number is a little low, but let's just take that number as a baseline. If we are starting there and then we're going to grow 25% in the next 30 years, well, by 2040, to tie this back to our Orthodoxy in 2040 video, we're looking at being at about 1.84 million people, Orthodox Christians, by it's a substantial growth. It's not the through the roof growth that our estimate is over 2 million. But even if Burge is right and we're wrong, and it's only 25% growth over the next 30 years, this still, it represents, we've still got to build parishes for those people. We've still got to work.
Yeah, I mean, if you're talking about 12% growth, which is what if you take Burge's 25% over 30 years and you do it over 15 years, you end up with 12. You have roughly 12%, right? There are around 2,000 Orthodox parishes in America. 12% growth would be a couple hundred more parishes opened over a 15-year period, which on the one hand seems manageable. It seems like that does seem manageable. On the other hand, I believe that is more than we've opened in the last 15 years, right? And you're going to need, so let's say that you need to open, so it's 2,000 parishes, right? 12%, that's 240, right? 240 parishes divided by a 15-year period. That is 16 new parishes each year. If you assume that we need priests to staff those parishes, then we need to have 16 new priests each year on top of whatever output we need to kind of fill our current needs, right? Again, we're talking, it seems like really small, right? 16, right? But in the last 15 years or so, if you look at the average, how many Eastern Orthodox priests does St. Vladimir's Seminary produce per year? How many actually go on to become Eastern Orthodox priests in America? And you're only talking like 7 or so, roughly. So, you'd need, say, and it's roughly the same for St. Tikhon's, Holy Cross. They're not that far apart on this. So if you just look at like St. Vlad's and St. Tikhon's, they would need to double their output, right? They would need to double the output. And that's not to deal with the priest shortage issues and the attrition and all of that. That's just to accommodate new parishes that we need to be establishing. So even that modest growth would be significant for us, especially in a time when other religious groups in America, other Christian groups in America are declining in many cases. Not all of them, but a lot of them.
And it's important to note that this is all good news. This is all great news. It's, if even somebody who thinks we're a rounding error says, they'll probably grow by 25% in the next 30 years, like, this is a good thing, you guys. Just for context, to talk about parish growth, in the last 15 years, the OCA, my church, planted roughly 6.8 parishes a year. So that's or not roughly, exactly. If you average it out, so doing 6.8 a year, and that's in the OCA, which I would say plants missions more aggressively than maybe other jurisdictions do. Not all other jurisdictions, obviously, but that's just it's a very missions focused jurisdiction.
So we have the Burge baseline of 25% over a 30-year period, or kind of rounding that to about 12% over a 15-year period. Seems modest, but still pretty good, right? Yeah. But our numbers, what we were looking at in our Orthodoxy in 2040 video, again, using that original baseline of 1.64 million today, we were conservatively estimating a 69% increase in the next 15 years.
Right.
More
and so
go ahead.
Part of the basis for this is the outsized share, again, relative to the rest of the population, the outsized share of Gen Z and Gen Alpha that we are finding within Orthodoxy. Yes. So I will give you an example of a couple of things, a couple of quick sort of numeric examples. So one of the things that we're seeing is that even in places where the overall numbers of Orthodoxy is declining, because we're now sort of hitting what is sometimes called, and I don't want to be grim here, but sometimes called the boomer cliff, right? So as we're hitting a place where we had the largest, by the numbers, the largest and also the wealthiest generation in American history. And those people are now senior citizens, right? And they're beginning to kind of die off. And so as we hit that, there's some shrinkage that is happening, especially in places where there's not a lot of, thinking specifically about like places in the Northeast, in the Rust Belt, places where there's not a lot of economic growth. You don't have a lot of young families moving there for job opportunities like you do in Texas or Utah or some parts of, some other parts of the country, right? So even in those places where you're seeing actually kind of shrinkage overall in the number of Orthodox Christians that are being reported actually showing up to Sunday liturgy, there's also a population swap that is taking place. So in one of our dioceses in the Orthodox Church in America, the just over the last 5 years, they've seen a pretty significant increase, about 34% in the number of 18 to 34-year-olds, which would basically be your Gen Z and Zillennials, or I guess. They've seen a 34% increase in parishioners. Like, these are people who are showing up to church on a regular basis, even as they've seen like a much larger decrease in the older population. So 81 plus, there's been like a 49% drop off. That shouldn't be surprising. People are over 81, but within the higher age brackets, so the Gen X and the younger boomers, they've seen maybe about a 14% decrease in the attendance of those people. So there is one of the things that is happening is that there's in the same way that we sometimes part of the post-COVID wave was that there was a big resort. And so you had, people leaving some churches to go to other churches, and people are kind of shuffling around. But there's also a resort that's happening demographically, just in terms of age, right? So anyway, that's just to give some context for part of why our number.
Comments on that, because and I think we can say this publicly because it's public data. They put that God bless them.
Yes.
This diocese puts them the data on the internet, on their website. This is the OCA Diocese of Eastern Pennsylvania, Archbishop Burke, who's been very gracious and has alerted us to the fact that they've been posting this data for years, actually. They're kind of doing a good job of being transparent. And from 2019 to 2024, the overall number of members of the diocese adult members of the diocese, I believe it was, fell by 7%. So you say, there you go, they're shrinking, right? But there was this swap that happened that's so striking where this is from 2019 to 2024. In 2019, you had this very aged diocesan population, right? It was a lot of old people in the parishes.
Right. The vast majority of the diocese is over the age of 65 or over the age of 60.
Well, at least they were, not anymore.
Yeah.
In
2019 is what I'm saying.
Yeah. In 2019, so like in 2019, almost 18% of the members of the diocese were over the age of 80, right? Over the age of 80,
right.
And then another almost quarter of the diocese was retirement age, like 60, over the age of 65. So you have this very old diocese that's now sort of become much younger, right? And so even though they've had net decline, the reason why they've had net decline is entirely because they lost like half of the over 80 population, which makes sense that in a 5-year period that includes COVID, the over 80 population in the diocese, which was a huge percentage, like basically collapsed, right?
Right.
What's amazing is that they've been so close to break even despite that, right? And it's because of this growth in younger demographics. And that's the thing that's really striking. And so when you start to see this kind of thing in a place like Eastern Pennsylvania, which we don't associate with, lots of growth, et cetera, that's an interesting sign. And that's the kind of thing you don't get unless you dig deeper into the numbers on this, right? Because overall, you'd still say net decline, but there's something interesting going on.
Yeah. So I think that this one of the stories that I think when Burge mentioned what he mentioned, he said, I think the Orthodox will do pretty good. They're going to see this growth. It's because of this. It's because of we have surprisingly for such an old church, we have a lot of youthfulness, and some of that, of course, I mean, a lot of that is young converts, but also a lot of it is just our other demographics, the other things that we have going for us. So yeah, it's very interesting. It's very interesting. Yeah,
the other thing is, when we were estimating that 1.64 million number that I published at Orthodox History, that was based on looking at lots and lots and lots of general population surveys, U.S. population surveys of the general population, some of them big, some of them small. And we looked at them in the aggregate, and we found that Orthodoxy represented roughly such and such, it was like roughly half a percentage point of the overall U.S. adult population. You apply that to the whole U.S. population, and you get about 1.64 million. That's how we came up with the estimate. What we've since, as we kind of dug deeper into these numbers, and as we acquired more data, like from the FIRE college student survey, what we found is that actually that 1.64 estimate was too low. And that the reason why it's too low is because general population surveys, so take the CES, which surveys like over 60,000 people a year, or you take the Pew survey, which was like 35 or something thousand people. Those surveys, when you look at the kind of package that they put out for people to take the numbers and analyze them, they have you do this. They put in this how do you call it? It's weighting, right? It's a weighting metric, and when Ryan Burge or other analysts are publishing on the CES data, they're not publishing usually based on the raw sort of data file. Yeah. They take their raw data file and they apply these weights. Can you explain why they need to apply weights to the data?
Yeah, so this is a pretty basic part of this process, which is not probably not well understood. But if you just go like download the raw CES data, for instance, you'll see, and then you go look at things that people are publishing on the CES data about Orthodoxy, about some denomination. What you'll see is that the numbers they're publishing don't actually match the raw numbers in the CES data. And if you don't know why, it can be initially confusing. You'll be like, they're trying to lie to us. They're trying to pull the wool over our eyes or whatever. But the reason that the weighting is there is because we know from various things like the actual census, like the United States Census and things like that, that the population of the United States has a certain distribution, a certain distribution curve. So, for instance, there are at present maybe about 51 million Gen Alpha in America right now, which accounts for 15%-ish of the American population. These are people born after the year 2013. That's Gen Alpha. There are Gen Zs, which is 97 to 2012. That's 21%, which is not the largest, but it's almost the largest population segment in the country right now, which is about 71 million. Millennials, which are, it's my generation, these people born between 81 and 96. And yes, I know people, sociologists like to play with the sliders on like when does a generation actually start and all these different things, but just kind of, this is from the U.S. Census Bureau data from 2025. That's what I'm going off of here. There's about 74 million of us, which is 22%, which is currently the largest demographic within the U.S. by just like 1 percentage point. But it's pretty evenly distributed right now. So Gen X, 65 million, 19%. Baby boomers, about 64 million, another 19%. And then the silent generation is only 14 million at 4%, roughly. And that's what you would expect. You would expect to see there's kind of a curve as older generations kind of start to die off. It's relatively flat right now because the baby boomers were so large. So even though most of the baby boomers are in their 60s and 70s right now, they're definitionally they're all in their 60s and 70s right now. They're because their starting population was so high, even though some of them have started to die off now, there's still a lot of boomers. So it's kind of flat at the top, and then
and so when you look at this,
big drop
and you
off
look at
the silent generation,
the distributions, so you have those distributions, right, for the country, and those are pretty much hard facts. Like we have those from really good data sources that are, and then you look at a survey like CES or Pew.
Yeah.
What do we find?
What you find in a survey like CES or Pew is that most of the people answering the survey are boomers, are baby boomers, maybe some older Gen Xers. But I mean, if you like break down the demographics of who's actually responding to these things, they're not totally representative of the American population. So why is this the case? Well, a lot of it has to do with survey method, right? So if your survey method is, I'm going to call you on the phone and say, hey, do you have some time for a survey right now? Or I'm going to send you a survey in the mail and say, would you take some time out of your day to fill this out and mail it back to me? Just go ask a Zoomer the last time they got a phone call that A, they just answered, and B, that they're actually were willing to like sit there and answer a bunch of random and weirdly personal questions about, right? So, okay, that doesn't work so well, right, for younger generations. And so what they have to do is they have to say, well, we know that the American population is that, and this is not just true for age, it's true for other things as well, like, racial information and stuff like that. But I'm just taking age as an example. So they say, well, we know that the American population actually has this distribution curve, that you have people fall into these different ages and age brackets. But also we know that the people who responded to our survey because of the survey methodology, so some methodologies skew older, some methodologies skew younger, isn't actually totally representative. So what we have to do then is basically apply statistical weighting. And I don't want to make it sound like people are just making stuff up, because there's a whole science around this, like it's a real thing. But we try to apply statistical weighting to the outcomes of the survey that we've conducted, to say, all right, well, based on the general distribution of race, age, gender, et cetera, in America, we're going to make basically add weighting, which will sort of correct the numbers that we're seeing on the raw data. It's a little more complicated than that, but that's just a simplified explanation of how that works.
Right. So the upshot of it is that with Orthodoxy, we know from the actual raw data from both Pew and CES, two really solid data sources, right? We know that Orthodoxy is sort of more represented. It's more has a larger share of Gen Z and also a larger share of millennials than it does its share of boomers and Gen X. Right. This is from those data sources. We know that Orthodoxy skews younger. Right. We also know from those data sources that their respondents skew older. Right. Which means there aren't as many Gen Zers in the survey as there should be based on how many of them are in the population. Right.
And so this is why if we do something like go and look at a survey that is just polling college students, for instance, which are going to be all Gen Zers pretty much, Orthodoxy looks like it's a lot larger than it does if you look at the overall general population.
Exactly. And so if you just look at, let's take just CES, the Orthodox percentage of the CES overall in 2024 was something like 0.5 percentage point, roughly.
Yeah.
If you just look at the Gen Zers that took the CES, that subset, Orthodoxy is like 1%. Right. So it's twice as prevalent in Gen Z in that survey as it is in the boomer generation in that survey, right? But we also know that Gen Z is underrepresented in that survey. So if we're going to take take all the Orthodox people in the survey divided by everybody who took the survey, you're going to get a number, an estimate that underestimates the Orthodox share of the population because they're under-surveying the very demographic that is most likely to be Orthodox.
Yeah. I would give that a strong probably, just because, as an analyst, I'm always worried about the margins of error on numbers like this that are so small. But what we can sort of do is taking things like the FIRE data and other stuff that's looking at college students, taking UCLA, those things.
Yeah. UCLA does an annual survey.
Now, again, there's a sort of a selection bias there in the sense that, okay, but most Gen Z isn't going to college, right? So then it's just like, okay, well, are people going to college more likely to be Orthodox, less likely to be Orthodox, right? Those are all kind of interesting questions. But I would say in general that our percentage, even if you go apply the weighting and everything, our percentage among Gen Z and Gen Alpha is definitely higher. Well, among Gen Z, we don't really have data for Gen Alpha, but our percentage among Gen Z is definitely higher than it is among the general population. I don't think there's really any question about that. And it also, going back down to the who's showing up on Sunday, question, it definitely tracks with what we are seeing. Seeing lots and lots and lots and lots of people aged 13 to 28, which is Gen Z. That's the window right now. Seeing lots and lots of people in their early 20s, early to mid 20s, showing up to liturgy, wanting to become Orthodox Christians, and it's not all the converts, but it is the main kind of age range for the converts that we're seeing.
And once you account for the biases in these surveys that we just talked about, and then you sort of try to correct for those, the estimate for the U.S. Orthodox population goes up from about 1.6 million to about 2.1 million.
Yeah.
If you just make those adjustments.
Yeah.
So obviously it's all kind of, in the grand scheme of things, it's small, right? But
and even then, we're talking about 400,000 people, or a little less than that because it's, like 300 something, okay, it's not a huge number of people. Again, as far as Burge would be concerned, that's essentially a rounding error. And again, the margins for error on some of these numbers are really, really high. But I do think that, and this is something I think that we'll be working on. Right now we're just kind of spitballing, but it is our intent to publish a much more detailed study of this, looking specifically at Gen Z, what we know about it, because of course this is where the funny thing is people are always, this was true in the Protestant world as well. If you went to like church planning seminars or anything like that, people are always worried about what are the young people doing? Where are the young people going? It's actually like too much pressure to be like a young person, because as soon as in the churches that I came from, which is a very small fundamentalist denomination, it was so rare to see a young person that if one of them showed up in your church, you were like, oh, we must immediately lock this person in the basement. Like, we can't let them go. And it leads to, we do all kinds of weird, goofy things when it comes to things like youth ministry, and where we sort of treat the youths as though they are a radically different species of human, and don't just need the things that all human beings need to flourish and to draw close to God. So it's a little side rant, but in any case, so that's, but the other reason that we always put our attention, there, and just when I say we, I mean American religion in general, is because, of course, these are the people who are starting or should be starting families. These are the people who are going to be the future of the church. So if you want to look at where is the church going, it's probably your best indication is at Gen Z. And I want to emphasize that this is why at OSI we're so interested in this question. It's fine to, yes, we can asterisk and qualify all these different things we're saying about the number of Orthodox Christians and who's actually showing up to Sunday liturgy and who isn't, all those things. Yes, I want to have all of those conversations. I welcome all of those conversations. But at the end of the day, the thing that I want to be able to do is to help the church plan for the future. And that's why looking at Gen Z is so interesting, because we all know it. Again, we all know our churches are filling up with these young people. And what are they bringing to the table? Where they're bringing a lot of really beautiful things. They're not bringing the same kind of baggage their parents were, but also they're bringing their own baggage because they were raised with an iPad, and because they learned about theology on YouTube, but they've never actually sat down and read a real work of people who will quote mine St. Augustine and have never read the Confessions. That sort of thing is what we're seeing happen now. So I just say all this to say, like, that's why we're so interested in this. And, we've got some projects underway, which I hope are going to, over the course of this next year, yield a lot more interesting data about what's going on with Gen Z. So
going back to the Burge and tying this into Gen Z, but going back to Burge, Burge has pointed out with last year, there were some headlines and some articles saying, see the rise of the nuns, not.
Yeah,
I wish it was the rise of like female monastics, but the rise of the non-religious, right? It has kind of tapered off, right? Has kind of leveled off, and we're not seeing the same increase. And so a lot of people started saying, "Hey, look, this is like a really good thing for religion in America. This is great news." And Burge kind of said, "Hold on, everybody," because he pointed out correctly that there is this, what you refer to as like that boomer cliff, right? That is this generational replacement that's naturally happening. We can't avoid it, where older people who are more religious as a group are going to die, and they're going to be replaced by younger people, who are growing up and who aren't religious. And so even if the growth of the nuns hasn't continued, it's kind of leveling off, it doesn't mean that we're not going to continue to see the de-religification of America, right? We're still gonna see these declines. But the very same principle, if you apply it to Orthodoxy in America, yields the opposite result. And that's what's so fascinating, is that very same generational replacement, because Orthodoxy actually skews the opposite direction of most of the rest of the population. We actually skew much younger. That as older generations die and younger generations take their place, obviously, people have to stay in the church, right? But we project to grow significantly based purely on that, not even on more convert surge, all this other stuff that we've talked about elsewhere.
We are looking at growing significantly relative to our current size, even if it's not significant enough relative to the general population for Burge to be super interested. Again, that's totally fine. I'm just worried about, like, what can we do with what we have to work with here. Something that I will say about the boomer cliff is that I think the challenges that it is going to present to churches in general financially cannot be overstated. This is the wealthiest generation in America, in American history. a lot of, by and large, they are not leaving legacies, even to their own children, let alone to churches. And so this question of kind of, all right, and then Gen Z is coming up, for instance, Gen Z and millennials are just less wealthy than boomers. We just are. And very often the most basic aspects of financial stewardship, like how to, forget balancing a checkbook. When's the last time you saw anybody from Gen Z like write a check? So forget balancing a checkbook. A lot of us, we do all of our banking, but also all of our purchasing just on our phone, and it's all at the click of a button, and it's super easy to spend money now. And so these are things that I think about in terms of one of the things that's going to become a pastoral necessity in the future, I think, especially for us as we, as this generation is going to increasingly like it or not, and whether or not we actually grow. And this is true for everybody. Gen Z will be the majority of the church in 20 years. Like it just will be, because the other generations will be aging out. So you can look at this and you say, all right, these are the people who are going to be running the church in 20 years. How many of them actually know how to do a budget? Like who's going to be your parish treasurer in 20 years? Like those kinds of things. I don't know. I think about this stuff a lot. Maybe it's a little silly, but to me, I think that it may be necessary for us to start thinking about one of the ministries that we can offer to people is basically to teach them the life skills their parents should have taught them. And it's what I like to call civilizational arts. And it's not the same thing as teaching the faith, but sometimes also, it might be necessary as part of being a good Christian. How can you tithe? How can you give alms if you just have no idea where your money is going, right? And so I was recently speaking to some of the clergy of my own diocese, the Diocese of the South, and I was really encouraging, we should be thinking about, hey, who are those older men in your parish who are good at business and they're good at finances? Older men and women who know these things and could put on a class and just say, like, here's how to do a budget. Here's how to read a book. Here's how to change the tire on your car and things like this. How many people are being taught those things? It looks to me, just at least from the outside, it looks to me like there's a kind of a big skill gap coming up, which is also important for us to talk about. And AI is not going to make this better. If you think about when your dad or whoever taught you to change a tire, he wasn't teaching you the act of changing a tire, because you can, you can chat GPT that now. You can look up it on YouTube or whatever. But when your dad taught you to change a tire, what he's teaching you is, here's how you maintain your vehicle. And think about, like, when should you start thinking about changing your tire? And here's how you get the right tool for the job. And here's how you put up your tools when you're done. And those are all things that are applicable way beyond just tire changing. So it might be time, for those of us who are, at least those of us who are elder millennials, which is apparently what I am now, or Gen Xers, it might be time for us to just say, hey, it's time to take some of the young guys and gals under our wings and start teaching them some of these basic things, because it will actually make them better parishioners, and it'll be better for the church in the future. We weren't planning on talking about this today, but it's been on my mind. It's been on my mind a lot lately.
By the way, speaking of the Diocese of the South, that is one of the dioceses, one of the parts of the church that's been growing rapidly. You have a ballpark estimate of this, right? That you just recently came up with. Yeah.
So attendance tracking, membership tracking, things like that, it's still very difficult to get anywhere in Orthodoxy in America right now. It just is. And this is one of the things that we're working on. And again, if you're a parish that is tracking attendance closely and you care about these things and you would like to, share those numbers with us, we'd very much like to talk to you. But one of the things that the Diocese of the South, for instance, is very good about is financial transparency. And so one of the things you can do is, it's hard to measure attendance week over week, but it is very easy to measure financial performance year over year. And it's in some ways a more important indicator because, of course, giving is a lagging indicator. People usually start giving to a church after they've already been coming for a while and they start to be invested. And again, a lot of young people coming to your church may have no idea that they should be giving, right? They just sort of assume, they show up and they say, well, not just young people, but they show up and they sort of assume, hey, it's nice that somebody's doing all of this. And they assume, it just all kind of pays for itself. So giving is a bit of a lagging indicator. But if we're looking at the giving over the last 15 years in the Diocese of the South, adjusted for inflation, we can see that the Diocese of the South has grown by 143% in the last 15 years. And that's adjusting for inflation. But it's and I've got all the charts and things like this. And this is some stuff that we'll be publishing in some reports later this year. I think kind of the idea of these, I want to call them stat chats. I don't know if that's like too goofy, but that came to me as we were talking. But part of the idea here is just like workshop some stuff in public and give people a sense of the kinds of things that we're working on. But yeah, that's one very important indicator of growth. We're looking at probably about 143% growth in the last 15 years in my diocese. Now, my diocese is one of the more, obviously, we are situated in the fastest growing states in the country. So it'd be actually surprising if we weren't having growth. But that's a significant amount of growth for a church. And if you just again, my challenge to my the fathers and brothers and to our bishops, when I was talking to them at the clergy conference, my challenge was really to say, hey, let's assume it's going to happen again in the next 15 years. What does it look like for our diocese to grow another 143%? And not just like in terms of like warm bodies in I was about to say in pews, but of course most of our churches do not have pews. But not just in terms of like head count at the door, but in terms of really sustained, invested people who are here for the long haul. That's the way that our diocese grew in the last 15 years. And we should be thinking about what would it look like to do so in the next 15. Now, for context, the Diocese of the South is a little over 90 parishes. A lot of those parishes are quite large, but, again, yeah, relative to the stuff that Burge is interested in, sure, 90 parishes is a rounding error. But another, 143%, 15 years, suddenly we're looking at a couple hundred parishes, right? And so that's what I'd like to...
I mean, a couple hundred parishes is like the entirety of ROCOR in America right now.
Right.
Which is also growing rapidly.
Which is also growing rapidly, yeah.
And the Antiochians have right now about 300 parishes, but they're growing. And I think that this looking at like, there's a more holistic view of growth that I think that this represents, because someone who is actually giving money to the parish, and we can track that. Like that's a hard number. That's not because it's usually pretty solid number. That's an indication of depth of engagement in church life, right? They're actually willing to put their money where their mouth is. And so the jurisdictions and dioceses that do track that or publish it in the case of, it's not just the Diocese of the South that has this data. A number of PA dioceses are very financially transparent about this kind of thing. So that's really exciting to be able to
Which I'm just going to say, everybody should be.
Mm-hmm.
I am big on this financial transparency bandwagon. I grew up in a bunch of little fundamentalist churches, and every single one of them had a guy who did the books and didn't tell anybody what was going on. And in every single case, there ended up being fraud. Like it's like you could sort of set your watch by it. So financial transparency is really important. Your parish should do it. Your diocese should do it. Your national, your national church should do it. So
I have one other thing on the growth, just to kind of to as we kind of close this out. We as you mentioned, we are really trying to do this year. One of our big projects and goals is to get really good at attendance tracking and to have more and more parishes that are sharing their weekly attendance data with us, so that we can start to have a much more nuanced picture of what does it look like, what does growth look like, all of this kind of thing. We do have parishes that already send us attendance data.
Right.
And one of the things that was almost alarming to me Because we pointed out, and we did this when we talked to Father Andrew Damick, we pointed out how there was no summer lull in attendance in 2025, that parishes across the country were reporting, not just no summer dip, but actually growth over the summer, which is just like unprecedented. But one of the things that I did was I took the parishes that do send us data right now, and I compared just the last 4 months, 5 months, 4 or 5 months of 2024 to the last 4 or 5 months of 2025. Right. So that's not even really including most of that summer stuff. That's just kind of winter time, like fall, winter quarters, right, of the year. And every parish that now, granted, they're not a representative sample, but every parish we had data for both years was at least 20% year over year growth in attendance. And this is for parishes that are doing weekly tracking, 20 to 30% for all of these parishes. Now, many of these parishes have already grown enormously up to 2024. So to have 20 to 30% year over year growth just in that one period of time, just in that 1 year, is incredible, right? It's Burge is talking about maybe 25% over a 30-year period, but we've got parishes that are growing 25% over a 1 year period, and there are quite a lot of them. So this is I think that estimate's a low ball. Again, he was probably more of a throwaway comment. I don't think he was.
Yeah, I think it was just off the top of his head. And you can make arguments. Anytime I come up with a cool thing to say, I always think of the counter arguments almost immediately in my head. It's just too many years of being in debate. You're the same way, because of your legal background. But one of the things you could say is, oh, it's specific to regions. Other regions aren't growing as fast. Yeah, we know. Part of what we really want to do is get more parishes enrolled and sending us this data, because what I'd like to do, and I've done the math, I know exactly how many we need in each region to give us a good representative sample of Orthodoxy across the U.S. And that's something I'm very interested in doing. So again, if you are watching this and you are the person who counts numbers at your parish, and whether you're the rector or somebody else who helps out, you'd be interested in sharing this data with us, please reach out. Please reach out to me or to Matthew. Yeah.
Yep.
Yeah. All right.
That
well,
does it, man.
Lots of good things there. Lots of interesting stuff going on. I think that this, again, the biggest challenge in analytics right now is just getting to as far as Orthodoxy goes, is I think really coming to a number that we can say with confidence, this is how many people we have, so we can say this is how much we're growing. That's why I always tend to make my numbers a little conservative. But even in the most conservative picture, even if we just take Ryan Burge's 25% in the next 30 years, it's lots of great news and also a lot of great challenges. So buckle up, and we got a lot of work to do.